Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this seminar on Mali and the Sahel region. My name is Linda Nordin, and I'm the Secretary General of the UN Association of Sweden, and I will moderate this seminar. The seminar is organized by the National Defense College and the Swedish Defense Research Agency. And let me also mention that it will be streamed on the web, so people can follow us live here. If you want to Twitter, please Twitter along and use the hashtag Sommartorg. I would like to start by introducing this eminent panel that we have to discuss this subject. To my left, we have Ambassador Jean-Pierre Lacroix. We have Magdalena Tam-Lindell from the Defense Research Agency. And we have Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Ottosson, just arriving from Mali. And we have Carl Sørensen at the National Defense College. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mali and the Sahel region has suffered from a weak state for a long time, but also organized crime and the presence of terrorist networks. But the international community is now stepping up its engagement in Mali, and as of today, the African-led mission AFISMA is now transferred into UN authority under the name of MINUSMA. The question we will discuss here today is what can Sweden and the international community do to promote peace and security in Mali and the Sahel region? And I would like to invite you, Mr. Ambassador, to start and give us the broader picture. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you very much to all of you for being here, and thank you for allowing this seminar to take place in English. I'm trying to do my best in Swedish, but I think that talking about Mali and Sahel really shows my limit there. I'll try to be very brief and first of all talk about the stakes of this situation in Mali and Western Africa. In other words, why does it matter to us? And I think you put it very clearly and well, Linda. It matters to us because it's a region that has been fraught with organized crime, with potential terrorist threats to us. And I think that is sufficient to explain why we have to care. And no, it is not far from us. It is very close to Europe. Be it France, but also Sweden, actually, because we are an open space. This is very good to be living in an open space, but the result of that is that if you're in Spain, you're also in Sweden, basically. So the threats that we are dealing with really matter to us. We have a land and a region that has been characterized at least by two things that are permanent in their history. One thing is the difficult coexistence between the nomadic people of Sahara and southern Sahel and the more sedentary people of the south. Today, these populations are living together, or rather they are coexisting in states that were drawn, or the limits of those were drawn after the decolonization, and their coexistence is difficult as ever. The second thing is that this region, Western Africa, has always been a region of trade and trafficking. It used to be mostly salt, millet, slaves, cola nut. Today, it's largely about illegal stuff such as weapons and drugs. And also human being, a new form of slavery, which is immigrant trafficking. In addition to that, you've seen a new form of power and a new threat under the shape of extreme Islamism and the money that goes with it. And this has combined with the frustration of many people, especially those belonging to these nomadic groups, who felt they are marginalized and who are easy prey to these radical groups who have a lot of money. So you have a very dangerous cocktail in that region. And what happened to Mali in 2012 was that you had a new occurrence of an uprising by one ethnic group of these nomadic population, the Tuaregs of northern Mali, who basically rebelled against the central government in Bamako, Mali. The reason was that they felt marginalized and disenfranchised by the central government. This is not a new story, and it is happening also in many other Western African countries. And they, the Tuareg, who were then regrouped under the name of Mouvement de Libération de l'Azawad, or MNLA, took arms against that government. But very soon what happened is that they were themselves overtaken by Islamist radical groups who are claiming themselves to be part of Al-Qaeda, under the name Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So that rebellion was eventually overtaken by extreme Islam associated to Al-Qaeda. Now, I want to stress immediately that organized crime is intimately connected with these armed groups, either these more ethnic-based group or the more extreme Islam-based group. And sometimes it's hard to see exactly where the limits are, actually. Most of the money comes from organized crime, as I said, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the border between those groups is very fluid. In other words, if you disenfranchise, if you're a young Tuareg or a young Arab pertaining to one of these Arab minority in northern Mali, or it can be northern Niger or Mauritania, then it suffices to propose a wage of a few $100 a month to attract you to any of these radical groups. That is more or less the situation that we collectively have been facing when the northern part of Mali was overtaken by this Islamic group. At that point, what was envisaged was a collective response, and in essence, the idea was that the African themselves, or an African force, would recover northern Mali together with the Malian armed forces. What happened, though, is that when the Islamist groups saw that we were close to achieving the putting together of that African force, then they thought that it was in their interest to basically go south and take over the whole of Mali. And I think that it is clear that the borders in the region of Africa being virtually non-existent, or in other words, they exist on the maps, but they're not practically materialized, then it would have been easy for all these groups to overtake the rest of the region. And then we would have basically a nest of terrorism and drug trafficking in the whole of Western Africa. So basically what was done at that point was that the French intervened because they were called upon that by the president of Mali. There was no one else than the French to do that in very short notice because of the pre-positioning of French troops in the region. But then the intention was to remain there for as short a time as possible on the national capacity. And that is why through a series of movement and efforts and diplomatic processes, we've moved to having this African force and now this UN force, which is actually taking over today and which is composed of African forces. So right now we are in a situation where the security is more or less under control, with the exception of a threat of potential terrorist act and suicide attack. but there is a lot to be done to complete the stabilization of that country and the region. And I've just mentioned 4 elements. One is political, make sure that we manage to have a new legitimate government. That is to say, we have to organize free and fair election. They will take place, or at least the presidential election will take place in end of July and early June. We have to make sure that there's a credible reconciliation process with the northern ethnic groups who rebelled against the government. We have to make sure as well that in terms of helping Mali, both humanitarian assistance to refugee, displaced person, all those who've been affected by the conflict, but also in terms of helping Mali for its development, we are there and we play the game and we meet our commitments. And I think in addition to that, 2 things. Make sure that we impress upon all the parties that there has to be a commitment to human rights, because otherwise we have no credible solution in sight, and also make sure that we pay attention to the region. So in a short sort of summary, I would say trying to answer to the question what the international community can do. First of all, keep the focus, because Mali and Western Africa are under threat of basically gradually going out from the front page of the media. And that is a danger, because we have to sustain the effort on the long run. 2, make sure the adequate resources are there. We have, all of us, to make sure that our commitments are actually made in reality by contributions and help and assistance. 3, empower the local. We don't do anything if there's no feeling of empowerment from the Malian themselves, and it's easier said than done. 4, on the ground, certainly avoid an us and them situation whereby the local people feel disenfranchised by this huge, massive arrival of international means and enormous footprint. And it is too often the case that an international operation driven by the UN gives the impression, with these massive SUVs and buildings, new buildings and so on and so forth, well-paid people, that a new country is building up within their own country. But that doesn't help really creating a sense of collective effort. And I think last but not least, and I was mentioning that before, keep the big picture in mind. That is to say, keep in mind that it's not only about Mali, it's essentially about the region. There's a huge effort to be made to make sure that the region at large is being taken care of, both in terms of security and also in terms of the kind of assistance that is needed to get these countries on the track of towards development. So I'll stop there. These were my few points. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, Ambassador of France. As far as I understand, France will keep some troops in Mali now, but we have a UN mission starting, but it will not be part of the UN mission, MINUSMA. Could you explain to us why that is?
Well, actually, the intention is to... we have currently more or less 3,000 troops on the ground in Mali. The plan is to go down to 1,000 at the end of the year. Not all of these troops will be on a national basis. Some of them will be under UN helmet, as we said, or they will be under with the UN force. I think we're talking about approximately 200. I've seen figures ranging from 150 to 250. The rest of these troops will be will remain on national basis because they have a combat mission to pursue when it comes to keeping going after those armed groups that are left in very remote places of northern Mali. But then what we also agreed and what we said throughout is that the French forces in Mali that are not under UN umbrella will be available to the UN force to come to help that force in case, and there is an agreement that is being completed between the UN and the French so that we make sure that it will be possible and also easy for the French force to help this UN force in case it is needed on the ground. And this is not a new formula. This is the kind of formula that we've also had in the in Ivory Coast, where you had exactly the same setting, basically a UN force, and next to it a French force ready to help, but having also another mission.
Thank you. Magdalena Tam-Lindell, what challenges do you see in Mali today, and what is the EU doing, what is the UN doing, and the African component, African Union as well?
Well, there are a number of international initiatives at the moment, but I thought I'd start commenting on the heading of this seminar, if Northern Africa is a new Afghanistan. We've seen these kinds of headings on Mali as a new Afghanistan or the Sahelistan. And perhaps that there were a few common traits at the outset with terrorist groups exploiting the fact that there was very low presence of the government in the country, which they could use to grow and create a base. I think, however, that comparison today isn't very helpful in explaining anything about the problems or the dynamics or about the solutions to Mali. It's a completely different setting. And so forth, and I think a very strong focus on the fight against terrorism could also create problems. It takes away resources from other issues, and as Mr. Ambassador mentioned, the question on organized crime, I think, is even more important in this part of the world. What happened in Mali last year has a background in chronic underdevelopment in economic terms, and also in the failure to control drug traffic. And this kind of organized crime has reached a level in Western Africa that actually undermines entire states and is behind several coups in the region. So that's very important. The Sahel region, which is the band of countries on the shore of the Sahara Desert, is characterized by weak governance in general in a number of countries, trafficking of goods, as you mentioned, also a great number of refugees. I think the number of refugees in and from Mali at the moment is estimated to 500,000 persons. And also malnutrition and recurring humanitarian emergencies. So it's really important to keep that picture in mind when instead of only having a war on terror focus, which is one tendency. And this needs to be taken into account by the different international interventions. MINUSMA is launched today, a UN intervention where Sweden will participate with troops under UN for the first time in a very long time. There is already the African-led mission in Mali, AFISMA, and you have the European Union training mission that we will hear more about going on since the beginning of this year. But also in the neighboring country, Niger, the EU has a capacity building mission in which the Swedish police participates. So there are a lot of initiatives. But I think you had a long list of important things. I have a few more, but I think given the problems behind the situation today, it's really important to have a wide reform of the security sector in Mali, but also in the neighboring countries, which also includes the justice sector, which should not be forgotten, and also to keep a very regional focus on all these missions, since the problems are not exclusive to one country. And I think finally, the most important issue is to create economic development, which is an explanation for a lot of these groups and their motives. Thank you.
There is a plan to hold elections on the 28th of July. Is that too early, in your opinion?
I think the background... Sorry. Hello. Yeah. There was a coup last year. There was an agreement by ECOWAS, the regional organization, that elections should be held within 1 year, counting from the beginning of April. And that's because you do not want a civilian interim administration that just goes on and on and on. Now, this has already been moved from April to the end of July. Those that are really into that question, seems like it's really too early when it comes to the technicalities of the elections, such as ID cards for the population and the possibility for refugees to vote. So there's still a discussion going on if it's really possible to have elections in a month. And I think it would be a great problem if there would be elections that are not accepted at all. That would just promote more instability. So I know the International Crisis Group has proposed that this could be postponed perhaps 2 or 3 months, something like that. But I think it will be very difficult to do this already in 4 weeks' time.
Thank you. Daniel Ottosson, Lieutenant Colonel from Mali.
From Sweden, actually.
From Sweden, but just coming home from Mali. You're part of the management of the EU training mission in Mali. What experience can you share with us from Mali?
Well, at first I would like to say thank you to the French ambassador for what France has done for Mali, because the leadership shown by France has been excellent, both before the mission and during this mission. France is being the framework nation and taking the lead in this European training mission in Mali. And we as Swedes should also be proud, because we were amongst the first nations taking part in this very important mission. So we can do a lot of things with the armed forces in Sweden, even though the media picture of the armed forces in Sweden has been fairly negative for the last months. In Mali, the European Union has done 2 things. The first thing has been an advisory part to look at the defense forces and the security forces in Mali. What are their current capacities and capabilities? The second one has been more into the media, and that is the training mission of Malian troops. The EU has decided to train 4 battalions of 700 soldiers, and we have just done the first battalion, who's been completing their training and are now on their way up to the front up north in Mali. If you look at the Malian armed forces and the analysis done by the European Union, it is basically an illusion. It is non-existent. There is no training for the troops. There is no officers or NCOs training. The logistical support chain is non-existent. In a layman's term, there is 1 rifle for 10 soldiers. There is 1 vehicle in 2 that works. They lack radios, and they lack other important equipment. They lack fuel for their cars. Basically, they lack everything. In order to establish a credible force, donations are needed. Donations from other countries, but we need to make sure that the donations are within the Malian interests and not becomes a military dump of old equipment. We need to make sure that they have the same type of caliber rifles, so we don't have different armaments and different calibers, because that will become a logistical nightmare to sustain. It will be impossible to sustain it. They need vehicles of the same sort, so they can use the same spare parts, the same logistical support to maintain their vehicles. They need radios that are able to connect to each other, and they need a human resources program to be able to train their forces, train their officers, and make sure that this is a sustainable force and not the illusion that it is at the current time. And the European Union has done a lot. If you look at the battalion trained, when we saw it when it came in and when we saw it when they moved out from training, I would say the increase is substantial. If you look at a Malian soldier before the training, he had shot maybe 5 to 13 rounds in total on his whole training. A Swedish soldier or a European soldier, by comparison, shoots about 1,000 or more rounds in his basic training. The soldiers now leaving the European Union and the training mission, they know how to aim a rifle, they know how to coordinate fire support, they can coordinate assaults, defenses, and movements. It has been a substantial increase in Malian capacity. And with the 4 battalions trained, I would say we're not there yet, but when we have done the 4 battalions, we have made a large contribution to Malian forces.
As far as I understand, the training mission is 15 months. What will you be able to achieve within these 15 months?
We will have 4 battalions that are, by African standards, very well trained and well equipped. The report to the Malian authorities concerning the state of their armed forces has been delivered, and it's up to the Malian authorities to make the decision on what to implement on all these issues that we have come up with. We will not be done in 15 months. The Sahel region and Mali is not a quick fix. It will take many years, and the solutions are not military ones. But military solutions are there to make sure that other solutions can be put in place. We need a secure environment to make sure that all the politics, social reforms, and all the rest of it can take place. Without security, there is no development. And that's why Mali needs to be able to restore their own security with their own means in Mali.
Thank you. Carl Sörensson, researcher at the Defense College. What problems and challenges do you see in Mali and the Sahel region?
Well, I think a lot of the most important problems have already been discussed by the panel. But I thought maybe I'll spend a little bit of time just touching upon one thing that we already mentioned, but I think is important and to understand, especially from an analytical point of view. And that is this mixture of terror, organized crime, and disenchanted minorities. And we see this trend from Mauritania with Akim to the shores of Somalia with Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda in Eastern Africa, via Nigeria and Boko Haram. These organizations are in a strange mixture of several different actors. As we already heard, the organized crime element is very important for them. In Somalia, when they Al-Shabaab's control of for instance, a harbor town like Kismayo have managed them to enrich themselves from what the pirates bring in. We had this incident, I think it was in February, in Algeria with a hostage taking in a gas facility by a terrorist leader associated with Akim, who's called Mukhtar Bel-Mukhtar, but he's also known by a nickname Mr. Marlboro, because he made so much profit smuggling cigarettes through the desert. And this suggests something what this is about. But it makes it very, very difficult from an analytical point of view to understand this sort of actor, because they're unpredictable in one sense because of the religious rhetoric, and all the time they're extremely incentive-driven from an economical point of view, just trying to maximize their gains. And they're very keen and skillful on hooking up with the local minorities who already been marginalized from the majority society. And this, in addition, makes it very difficult to sort of get hold of how these organizations actually work and what they do. So I think we need to start to think more about what they're about, what they're doing, and also how they actually work for long term, because you're going to see differences when you move along the different Sahel countries, but it's important to try to capture what they're actually up to, because if you talk to the local population, they're often very frustrated with these actors, because they get often caught between them and the security forces or international interventions, and they're the ones who in the end always suffer the most from it. So what can then be done? Well, I think some more thought on a strategic level maybe from the European Union would be in place, because as it is now, it's often very reactive. I think in Sweden a lot of people got very surprised by the French intervention, although for us who have been following the region, this has been in the cards, so to say. We know that this has been problematic region for a long time. And the reaction then often is that when France makes an intervention, then we think, oh, maybe it's a colonial thing, and we get hesitant to know what to do. Instead of maybe having thought about this a little bit and have our own analysis, we might be able to engage with the countries that do want to make a difference in these countries, and perhaps also team up with them and have our own idea of what should be done and see what Sweden could contribute with. And last, I think what is sometimes forgotten is that we need maybe to listen a little bit more to what these leaders say, because they've been saying what they need for a long time. And I think there's an opportunity now coming up in Paris. I think it's the meeting of the all heads of states of Africa go to Paris to talk, and invited by the French president. And I think perhaps this is a good opportunity also to not only listen to what they say, but also ask things that we would like to know when we try to engage with these countries and when there are problems.
Thank you, Carl. So you all give a rather complex picture of the situation in Mali, not a quick fix. Carl, and you also highlighted the importance of more strategic thought and more analysis on how to deal with these terrorist organizations in Northern Africa. What would such an analysis encompass from your perspective?
Well, that's a good question. There's several different steps, of course, but one thing is, for instance, to try to engage with the local organizations that already exist, and such as ECOWAS. The African Union, for instance, they have a so-called counter-terrorist office in Algiers, but as far as I know, it's been very difficult for the European Union to facilitate help to this mechanism for various reasons. And often when a dialogue gets sort of interrupted on an inter-organizational level, it sort of fades out. And I think it's important maybe to sort of reinitiate that, because there is knowledge in these countries, especially in a country like Algeria, who supports this counter-terrorist cell a lot. How you could go about it. For instance, not maybe focusing only on hard security, but also on sort of a general security environment, because that in turn will sort of it would stabilize areas, but it will also be able enable us to identify players which are the movers. Because let's face it, there are some leaders in these regions that are putting pressure on what's happening, such as Mukhtar Belmokhtar and Godani in Somalia, for example.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite you now, the audience, if you want to ask some questions. Please introduce yourself and pose a short question. I have one here and also the gentleman behind. Thank you.
Yeah. My name is Anita Fredegård, and I've been in the International Women's League for Peace, amongst other things. And I always say, jail them, not kill them. This is, I know, severe international crime, and it's very hard when you get religious and economical, and you have another group, the Tuaregs, that feel exploited. But I know I would say you do your best. It's your job to be military. And you are not evil people at all. You're trying to see this country need to be helped, but it's a bloody job. Sorry. And I only see we have to strengthen United Nations, seek for diplomacy, dialogues, and what the poor, discriminated groups is to be able to be self-sufficient so they don't fall in the hand of criminal groups. And the ones who do criminal action, you should support the police authorities in Mali, train the police authority and bring them to court and jail them, not killing.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman behind, please don't forget the question mark behind your intervention.
I have a question mark.
Good.
Hi, my name is Peter Jan Wenningermont from Doctors Without Borders, MSF Sweden. I have a question for Daniel Ottosson. So thank you very much for your very vivid description of the Mali troops. That it sounds like a big challenge. I wanted to ask, because we have been, as an organization, present with projects in Mali, both before, during, and after the war. And one thing which we found an enormous challenge, and that still is the enormous fear with the local population, not only for rebel groups, but even for the Mali military, who have been committing acts towards the population. So we basically have enormous challenges in negotiating access, getting access. How do you see upon the near future, how can these challenges be met? And as you might know, we are fairly critical as to where civil and military or humanitarian and political military agendas are being coordinated. In theory, it's a good thing, but I just want to ask you, are you in any way positive? Will the Malinese population in any way be more safer and more secure in accessing humanitarian needs?
And I think we take one more question. There was someone, I think there was someone here first. I remember you.
My name is Myra Beckman. Just interested. I also have a question for Daniel Ottosson. You mentioned in your introduction that you wanted to see that everything being brought into Mali now, that it was of the same same kind of materials, that it was possible to use it with spares and everything. Many years ago, I was working in Tanzania, and I was coordinating water supply assistance to Tanzania, and the huge problem was that each country brought in their own equipment. My question is, how do you do it? Because it was not possible to do it in Tanzania, and Tanzania ended up in a disaster.
And I will take one more, and then I will let the panel respond.
Hi, my name is Nick Grinstead, also just interested. Mr. Sorensen, you touched on Algeria. First, two-part question relating to Algeria. Algeria is the key regional stakeholder. How can France, the EU, Sweden, on a bilateral, multilateral level, engage Algeria currently to use its experiences to help Mali in the security aspect? And the second part is, how can they engage Algeria without turning Mali into a new Algeria with its sort of less than democratic tendencies? So how do you create a stable security situation and engage on a diplomatic level without encouraging sort of this over securitization of the problem, and still allowing for political engagement and political legitimacy?
Okay, thank you. Who wants to start from the panel?
Well, I got two questions and one statement, so I think I'm in line to start.
Please go ahead.
Let me just address the representative from Médecins Sans Frontières. Thank you for what you're doing. We are on the same side, I think. The security situation in Mali has to be addressed by the Malians. Within the training concept of the troops that is done by the European trainers, there is international and humanitarian law as one of the blocks that they need to study. And it's been done by British instructors, and it's to a high standard, I would say. But it's one thing to teach, it's another thing to learn. We do our best, but we cannot guarantee that the Malian soldiers sent to the front will adhere to international law. We can only teach them and try to tell them that it is vital, it is important, and you need to address this. But it is a part of the training concept. When it comes to the material issues, the European Union has addressed this by what is called a clearinghouse cell, to make sure that all the donations or the suggested donations goes into Brussels, are looked upon and decided upon with the military knowledge needed to make sure that we accept the donations that fit into the new Malian armed forces, and that we do not take in different materials, different vehicles, and non-compatible parts. So it is being addressed. However, now the UN will take over this mission, and we need to establish some sort of liaison with the United Nations to make sure that this continues in the right direction. But it is being addressed, and so far so good. So far so good. You made a statement, so I will make a statement as well. The terrorist organizations are not likely to adhere to diplomatic reasons, because if they were, they would have done it. But now they are terrorists, and also terrorists. And this is a Malian problem, and the Malians need to address this. Yes. If you're shot upon, you will shoot back. You need to protect yourself.
Yeah, but you can protect in different ways.
You can protect in different ways, but this is a Malian issue.
I never believe in putting more heavy arms and materials.
This is not done by the European Union. The European Union is training. We are training Malian forces to be able to counter the threat they have in their own country. And it is security forces and armed forces. They're doing their best. The UN is there to enhance security. That is what we're doing. And if the rebels and terrorists or criminals want to be a part of that, they're welcome. If not, they're outside.
Sorry, excuse me. Maybe in connection to this, Magdalena, how can we ensure from the international community that the forces are under civilian and democratic control? Because I think maybe that is what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's very important. There are numerous examples of in Africa of support, outside support to national armies that has gone quite bad. The leader of the coup last year has been trained by the US, at least 5 higher courses in the US and so forth. It's not easy. I think it's extremely important that the European Union, and I know the European Union has the ambition to work with the whole military and the whole system, but it's always easier to start with training, basic training. That's the least controversial, and it's concrete, it's technical. And then as you move higher up and start working with how to lead leadership management issues, it's more difficult. And it's even more difficult when you come to the democratic control. And the problem at the moment is that there is no democratic government in Mali. There's a civilian administration. So apparently there is no democratic control of the troops at the moment. And I think that when we engage in these missions, we have to feel a responsibility all the way. If we enhance the capacity of the troops to actually fight a war, then in the end, if it goes bad, I'm certain that the responsibility will fall back on the European Union. But I know that the ambition is to have a very broad perspective. I don't know, however, if you said that they had done the analysis, a needs assessment. But it's really important to do that because there are too many ad hoc training done for armies, which in the long run may not enhance security.
Thank you.
Just to address your concerns, France has just decided to send advisors to the newly trained units of Malian troops sent to the north. So there will be advisors following the troops up north. Thank you to France again, because that's the only nation that has decided to send advisors to this very important mission.
I would like just to jump in and comment on your question. I think you said something very important, train the police as well. At the moment, we are promoting the view within the EU that we should also train Malian police because they have their responsibilities, such as well as the armed forces have their responsibility. They also comment on democratic control on the armed forces. It's hugely important, but then it starts with one thing: a legitimate government and a legitimate president. Otherwise, the armed forces don't have anyone to connect to and to control them in a legitimate manner. And that's why the holding of election as early as possible, at least the presidential election, is to us very important. Now, on this thing, there's one crucial element that is at the moment sought after by all those who are organizing this election, and it's the practical means of distributing the electoral cards. And for that, there's a huge need of air transportation. One thing that is crucial is to make sure that the UN will have these means, and that is why Sweden contributing a C-130 plane is absolutely vital, and having that plane on the ground as soon as possible is also vital, as well as having helicopters, which I think the UN will end up renting for that mission regarding the election.
Carl, maybe you want to comment on something?
Yeah, I was just
Algeria?
thinking, and I think perhaps I'll stick my neck out and say that I think also that it's better when police handle terrorist activities and threats, because when you do when you engage a terrorist cell militarily, it looks in a sense often nice because it's effective and it sort of destroys the target. The problem with these cells, it's that they are cells. There are several of them, and if you take one out, there's another one left. Just as with other types of criminality like organized crime, it's better if you think about this as a long-term issue and problem, and then you work on it successively. with the police. That's how we do it in Europe, and that's what we would sort of hope that Malians would be able to do. Currently, there's not a police authority that could sort of tackle these terror organizations. There's none of them around. I mean, the entire security forces were pushed back to Bamako. So then the issue becomes much more difficult. But I think in principle, most people would agree with you that it's a police and law enforcement matter. Maybe I should address this about Algeria
yes, please.
problem. Well, I think in a way, engaging Algeria is, as you mentioned, I also think it's, in a sense, key to some of the success, if you want to have success in Mali. And I also think that actually, in a way, you managed to do that now. Of course, I know that they let up their airspace for the French Air Force, for instance, when they were doing their flybys. So that's, for Algeria, that's a small thing, maybe it looks like, but I think for Algeria to open up their airspace for France, it's not a small matter. And I think perhaps you can see a trend in this from several perspectives. And one is that Algeria is very worried about the Arab Spring. It's worried about the different activity from Hakim, and for instance, the gas facility prison taking or hostage taking was something that they were sort of renewed their fears about what this could open up to back to the 1990s, for instance. Yeah. So they're very afraid of this, but at the same time they're cautious. Well, we could hope that they continue to let EU and France to operate from their airspace, but maybe also be more active and proactive along their border, because these areas are huge, but the Algerians have proved that they're quite good at knowing what's going on alongside the borders if they want to. So keeping them engaged in this conversation, which I think they're also interested in themselves, might prove a way forward in this matter. And how do we stop Mali not becoming an Algeria? I think that's not. When I think about Mali, the Malian problem, it's not that I'm afraid that it's going to become like the situation in Algeria in the 1990s, so then with 100,000 dead and then a sort of military state. I think it's more along the lines of perhaps the security situation in Côte d'Ivoire or something like that, where there's a division of country and there's complications around elections and postponements and these things. I think that's more that's a higher risk, if you will, than going the way that Algeria went. I hope that answers your question.
I just would like to add that equally important is Libya, and particularly the southern border of Libya, from which most of the weapons that were used by the groups came from. There's also a plan on which we think it's very important to advance, and that is to make sure that to help the Libyans to secure their southern border. Otherwise, we are under the threat of having more insecurity coming from that part of the world. I wanted to add also on police the fact that the UN operation is not only composed with military and civilian, it will also have a very important police component for 1,400 personnel. The problem that the UN always faces when it comes to finding, to basically putting together these units, is that it's very hard to find police personnel to send them in these international missions. It's particularly hard to find French-speaking police officers. So I guess that it will take much more time to form all these units in the UN mission. But their role will be also crucial.
I can just add one thing on the police missions. The European Union has another mission in Niger, the EUCAP Sahel, that was planned. It was initiated in August last year, and I think the opinion was that Mali was actually in most need of that support, but the circumstances did not allow for the mission to start there. So it started in Niger, which was much more positive, and that is more directed to the issue of police and gendarmerie. And the idea is to spread it to Mali and to Mauritania. So there have been plans for such a mission for quite a long time, but the government in Mali, the old government in Mali, was not the best partner for the European Union.
Magdalena, could you please mention something about the challenges of building institutions in Mali and the coordination between the EU and the UN and the African states?
Well, it's difficult. Institution building is very long-term and very difficult. And I think a big challenge now is the fact that there are a number of international organizations going into Mali, the European Union, the United Nations, the African Union, ECOWAS, and then all these bilateral initiatives. So it's the same thing as when it comes to military material, that you cannot build up too many different systems at the same time. So the need for international coordination will be huge. But the most important thing is that there is a Malian leadership and that there's a Malian political plan for development that the international community can join into, instead of the plans being made by foreign countries or foreign institutions. It has never worked and will not work this time either. So it's really crucial to have a legitimate leadership in Mali.
Thank you. Ottosson, what advice would you like to give the Swedish soldiers now going to Mali? I think there might even be some on their way as we speak now. I'm looking at Anders Silver. Maybe, maybe they have landed already. Please.
Drink a lot because it's very warm, and drink water. No, it's a very important mission. I think you're referring to the UN mission.
MINUSMA, yes.
That is critical, and Sweden is now contributing with Hercules, an airplane, to make sure that we can fly in goods and material to Mali, because there is, as you know, no seaport, so it's needed to fly in everything. And this is essential, and the Swedish Hercules can land on most of the airfields in Mali, so it's key. It's really key. And it's a very important mission, and I wish them the best of luck.
And for your information, Sweden will contribute with around 70 Swedish soldiers to the UN mission there. We have one more question. I just really wonder if we have time for it, but let's try. If it's brief, at the front. And then we'll do a final statement.
Oh, thank you. My name is Hannah Fisher. I actually work with the U.S. Congress, with the Congressional Research Service, though I'm not here in any kind of official capacity. But I was just curious. It's my understanding that there is potential for Mali to break up under ethnic lines, and I just kind of wanted to ask a little bit more about that. It's not something I heard a lot about today, so I just wanted to ask about. I understand that there's a lot of internal strife also with, Southern Malians feeling distinct from Northern Malians, tribal Malians feeling distinct again, problems that way.
Thank you. That's a larger, big question, but I think, Carl, would you like to try and answer that, and maybe also give your prospects for a stable and democratic Mali?
I don't really know what to say. I think maybe also the ambassador might have something to add on this. But I mean, not the basic, but one of the main issues I would say are the Tuareg groups who are part are nomadic groups that have been moving between Mali and Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, and Niger, and that's they feel entitled to and to what basically you could describe as part of northern Mali, and they feel that they've been discriminated against from the centralized government, from Bamako. As a response to that, they've always been in opposition to, or not always, but for a long time been in opposition to Bamako, and it was like something like a vortex that happened around when Gaddafi was coupled, because all of a sudden you have all these Tuareg fighters who'd been in Libya fighting with weapons, teaming up with various terror groups, and gaining this huge momentum simultaneously as there was, or partly because of this momentum that they were gaining, a coup in the capital. So that's why also they from going to being rather weak, they gained a lot of strength all of a sudden and got themselves into a different position. However, they realized after a while that they did not support the demands that were issued by several of the terror groups they were working alongside. So after having had some initial success in their advance together with these groups, they split from them and they also, I think, officially gave up the idea of an independent northern Mali and now say they want autonomy, which I think is an issue for discussion. But please feel free to sort of fill in the blanks. This is a very sketchy picture I was painting now.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's true that Mali is a very divided country with big differences between the north and the south, and also a strong feeling in the north that they have been discriminated. So the uprising we saw last year was, I think, the 5th uprising since Mali became independent in 1960. And there's a difference in ethnicity and in religious beliefs and so forth. That doesn't mean that a country has to split up. At the moment, the political Tuareg groupings have backed from their demand for independence. But this is linked to the fact that they have to be included and be given a part of the political decision-making. And so there are objective differences when it comes to governmental investments in infrastructure and in education and hospitals and so forth between the two parts of the countries, and of course that creates a conflict.
Yeah, Mali is very heterogeneous and all the ethnic groups are intertwined. There's no practical way in which you could see a division of it. That's the first thing. Second thing is the southern part includes 90% of the population and the northern part more or less 10%. The third part is, I would say, it's hard for these nomadic group to be in the same state as the sedentary group in the south. But at the same time, they've been coexisting all along throughout history. It was a difficult coexistence, it still is, and one should not romanticize the Tuareg or the northern nomadic groups. There's a lot of resentment in the south because these nomadic groups were essentially responsible for implementing the slave traffic. They were those who were basically raiding the southern region and then transporting the slaves to pretty much everywhere in the world where slavery was practiced, which was essentially everywhere. So it's a very fraught, complex, and filled with resentment situation. I think our best bet is to work on national reconciliation, and it's tough because at the moment we have the tools, but at the same time we feel there's a commission for reconciliation that has been put together, but we feel that it's tough to convince the Malian leadership and the Malian political class that there has to be a real effort to be made on reconciliation with the northern ethnic groups, particularly with the Tuaregs. They're deemed responsible of what had happened to Mali by these people in the south, but we have to work on them to convince that reconciliation is the only way.
And thereby, we need to finalize this seminar. I would like to thank you all for coming. And before we give a round of applause to the panel, I'd like to inform that the next seminar here will be at 3:45, and it will be on internet verktyg för radikalisering. Please, a warm round of applause to this eminent panel.